Section 16 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Weber and Contemporary Opera Composers. Vienna had now for a long time been the great center to which musicians were attracted. Mozart and Haydn met there, and many other musicians famous in their day made their home there. It was to this city that there came in 1805 Franz Anton Weber, an uncle of the Constanze who had married Mozart, and with him his young son Karl Maria, who became later a well-known musician. Franz Anton Weber belonged to an old noble Austrian family who had been devoted to the stage and to music, and when his youngest son was born, he made up his mind to have him trained as a musician. Karl Maria Weber, 1786 to 1826, was a very delicate child. He could not walk until he was 4, and then only lamely. But before he could walk or read, he began to learn music. His father, who had had an important position suitable to his noble rank, had lost both his post and his income before Karl Maria's birth, and now he toured from town to town with a traveling company of actors. His influence on his son was not good. He was constantly in debt, and constantly inciting his son when he was older to foolish and evil ways of living, though he was always made to compose and was given lessons at the various places where they stayed. The regular musical instruction, which would have been of real value to him, he did not receive for many years. Indeed, at one time, Weber's father made friends with Sennefelder, then a starving poet who had just invented a new way of cheaply reproducing manuscripts, a method which is now called lithography. Franz Anton Weber joined Sennefelder in this work, and Karl Maria, who was then 16 years old, was also taught to lithograph and worked with such interest that he made many improvements in the method. However, Franz Anton Weber and Sennefelder quarreled, and when a fresh tour brought the Webers to Vienna, the father determined to again give his son music lessons. Instead of choosing one of the recognized teachers under whom Haydn and Beethoven had studied, he chose a man called Abbe Vogler, who was a great social success, but was not a very talented composer. He became, however, very attached to young Weber and procured for him a post as conductor of an opera house orchestra at Breslau. Weber did his work well. He became an excellent pianist, an inspired conductor, and proved himself a really great musician. He had other appointments after Breslau, but wherever he lived, he was followed by his unfortunate father, whose evil ways had a very bad effect on him, and who in the end stole a large sum of money belonging to the king, in whose employment Weber then was. Weber took the blame on himself, but he lost his appointment. The shock of this exposure made him give up much of the excitement and pleasure which he had indulged in under his father's influence, and he settled down to hard work at his music. It was soon after he had been appointed director of German opera at Dresden that Weber began his first famous opera, Der Freischütz, and it was while he was living in Dresden that he had one of the greatest happinesses of his life, his marriage to Caroline Brandt. His life at Dresden was very hard and not very happy. He had to rehearse and conduct all the German operas, to conduct what was called the table music while the king dined, to conduct in church twice each Sunday, to provide special compositions for festive occasions, and also to rehearse and conduct Italian operas if the other conductor had leave of absence. This would have been extremely hard work for a strong and healthy man, but for Weber, who was always delicate and with a tendency to consumption, it was killing. He worked hard with his orchestra and singers, and made them understand every note and produce finished and vivid performances. Sometimes he would have as many as 16 rehearsals of a work, each of several hours, and the strain of listening to each note and going over part after part until each performer thoroughly understood the way it was to be produced must have been very great. His appreciation of other musicians' music was sincere. He chose and produced with the greatest care works he considered beautiful. Mozart was his idol. Beethoven's Fidelio he found full of beauty, and works by other less famous composers were given with great care and understanding under his direction. Work alone would not have been so exhausting to him, but Dresden was full of gossip and pettiness. The king was under the influence of one of his chamberlains, whose sympathies were with Napoleon, and therefore against the new German spirit, which was producing beautiful music and literature. Weber had been much influenced a few years before in Berlin by the spirit there. It was the moment when patriotic Germans, knowing that Napoleon meant to use part of the German army against Russia, determined that it must be prevented at all costs, and secret societies were formed to unite Germans against Napoleon. Weber had felt something of the reality of this patriotism as opposed to the sordid life he was accustomed to with his father, and it had led him to write some German patriotic songs which are still sung by students, songs which then made him famous and are still some of the finest national melodies. The Chamberlain of the King knew Weber's sympathies and was determined to oppose them. Insult after insult was offered him. His music was commanded and then not used, and constant difficulties were put in his way. We should not now expect to see a famous composer conduct music while a king had dinner. But it was part of Weber's duty. He had to stand on a platform with the musicians, dressed in the court dress, a cocked hat under his arm, and sword trailing at his side, and conduct different pieces of music, one to the soup, one to the roast, and so on, and then stand in silence while the royal family left the room. His first famous opera, Der Freischütz, was produced not in Dresden but in Berlin, where he had many friends. Weber worked hard at the rehearsals, and the theater was filled to overflowing. All the famous people in Berlin were there: Heine the poet, E.T.A. Hoffmann the writer, Mendelssohn, then a boy, and many others were among the audience. The applause was extraordinary. The overture had to be repeated, and there was an ovation at the end of each act. Afterwards, all the singers, the famous literary men, and Weber's friends met, and Hoffmann crowned him with a wreath of laurel. The rejoicings were not over till 3 in the morning. His reception in Dresden was, however, cold and even insulting. About 7 years later, he again obtained leave and went to Vienna to superintend the production of his next great opera, Euryanthe. Beethoven was then living a little outside Vienna and asked Weber to go and visit him. Weber drove out with his two friends and found the great musician, his thick hair now gray and white, and he himself in a desolate-looking room in the utmost disorder. Music, coffee cups, money, clothes, all strewn about and dusty. But Beethoven treated Weber with great consideration, promised if he could to go to the performance of his new opera, and Weber wrote warmly in his diary of Beethoven's kindness. Euryanthe was produced with great success, but after he left Vienna, adverse criticisms appeared, and Weber's delicate health suffered from hearing some of the unjust judgments on his work made by people who were envious of his position and genius. Meanwhile, Der Freischütz was being a great success, and it was played in London at 3 theaters at the same time: Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Lyceum, and Weber was asked if he would write an English opera. He was now so ill that he consulted with his doctor whether his health would allow him to travel to England and undergo the tremendous strain of rehearsals. When he understood that nothing but complete rest, no composing, no music, would give him a chance of life, and that only for a few years more, he bound the doctor to secrecy and accepted the English offer, determined if he could, in the few remaining months of life, to make some provision for his wife and children. He learned enough English to be able to write to English words, and he traveled to England through Paris, where he had a triumph, for whenever he appeared in the opera house he was recognized and applauded. He landed at last in England, and driving from the coast to London, went straight to the house of Sir George Smart in Great Portland Street. He conducted the rehearsals of his new opera, Oberon. He also visited people, among others the Duchess of Kent with her daughter, afterwards Queen Victoria, who was then a child of 7. The Duchess sang Weber's songs while he played the accompaniment. The performance of Oberon was wonderful, and Weber was called for at the end, a thing that had never happened to a composer in England before. However, Weber felt that he had come to England to make money, and must give a concert and do anything else he could, since he was too ill to hope to do much more for his family. He was very homesick, and longed to be back in Dresden with his wife and children. The concert was not a financial success, and he was now so alarmingly ill that 2 doctors decided he must stop all public appearances. Weber, delighted to feel that he was now free to start home at once, refused to stay and rest. He bought presents to take back and took farewell of all the people who had been kind to him and had helped him to make his stay in England successful. He hoped to be home by the end of June. On June 5th, he seemed very exhausted. Friends had come to say goodbye to him in Sir George Smart's house, and one offered to spend the night with him, but he refused. The next morning he was found lying peacefully. He had died some hours before. He was buried in London, but when later Wagner became director of music at Dresden, he obtained permission for Weber's remains to be brought back to Dresden, and the singers who had so often sung under Weber's direction sang over his grave. To Wagner and the other great musicians who came after him, Weber has always seemed an embodiment of what is best in the spirit of Germany of his time. When he lived, Italian opera was still the most admired, and there was very little German opera. Weber knew that in Italian opera the secret was in the actual singing and in the wonderful and complicated arias which needed great vocal execution and skill. To the new German spirit, such music lacked depth of feeling and was not really dramatic, however perfect each song might be in itself. In German opera, the serious and beautiful intent of the music as a whole was what mattered. When Weber lived, a great literature was growing up in Germany. Heine, Hoffmann, Goethe were writing, and many others, and Weber was one of the first musicians who was a cultivated man, well-read and intellectually developed in other ways besides music. Though Weber's operas are his most important works, and his genius lay mostly in his dramatic work, his originality in other ways is great. He did not carry on the old ideas. He invented new ones. He produced effects in piano playing which underlie the piano playing we now hear. The first German songs, Lieder, as they are called, indeed all modern music for orchestra, opera, piano, and voice, seems to have grown from the new sparkling, moving music that he wrote. Weber embodied the romantic spirit. The classical spirit, which had lived in the old opera composers, had been an aim at beauty, and a beauty perfect in an almost impersonal way, perfectly balanced form, beautifully moving sound. But with the composers who followed Weber, the romantic composers as they are called, the aim changed. Music to them had to illustrate and enforce their feelings and emotions, and form was not of the first importance. We can see this in the overtures to Weber's operas. Mozart's and Gluck's overtures are each a perfect piece of orchestral music, not necessarily connected by melodies with anything that comes afterwards in the opera. They are just beautiful pieces of music fitted to introduce the opera that followed. Weber, however, used in his overtures parts of the melodies and effects that were to occur in the opera itself, and though the overture played by itself would not be a perfect, complete piece of music with balanced form, it was a sort of vivid illustration of the opera that was coming, and prepared people's minds for the sort of words and feelings they would subsequently have portrayed to them. There was an element in Weber's music, and that of many composers after him, which seems to belong especially to the music of this time, and that was the expression of what we should describe as fanciful conceptions, music suitable for fairies and for magic of all kinds, and for fantastic characters, human and otherwise. Such fanciful conceptions had appeared in isolated cases before, but never to the same extent or with such importance. There was much of the same spirit in the literature of the day, and it had a definite effect on composers. Weber's music for these magic and fairy-like conceptions is indeed imaginative and beautiful. Weber will always be remembered for his three famous operas, his wonderful songs, and his piano music, which has been played by all the great pianists since he lived. Today, we do not often hear his piano music, but it has inexhaustible brilliance and vividness, and his charming piece, Invitation à la danse, is so melodious and gay that it is known to everyone. The immediate and lasting success of his operas is due not only to the beautiful melodies, like folk songs, with which they abound, but to the wonderful vividness with which Weber uses them and the brilliant effects he obtains from the instruments and orchestra for which he wrote. It was partly during Weber's lifetime that there lived for some time in Italy and later in Paris a famous composer of Italian operas, Rossini, 1792 to 1868. Rossini had wonderful natural gifts, among them an inexhaustible vein of melody. He wrote over 40 operas, many of which contain much lovely music. It is, however, full of florid passages to which the singers of his day were accustomed, and which gave them special opportunities to display their voices and powers. Rossini became so important and so powerful that he was able to stop singers putting in passages of their own, called cadenzas. He had to write cadenzas for them, but these were part of the music, and not just passages of sound introduced by the performer, whether suitable or not. In most of his operas, Rossini wrote for the Italian taste of his time, a love of brilliant displays in singing and taking melodies. And such music is no longer so attractive as it was, nor can singers sing in the same finished and wonderful manner. We still hear occasionally singers able to make great effects with the florid arias of this Italian opera, its trills and runs and brilliant passages, and its gay melody. But we seldom hear operas of this kind performed. Two of Rossini's operas, however, are still well known, Il Barbiere and Guillaume Tell. Guillaume Tell was the last and certainly the greatest work he produced. It has no excessive ornamentation like his earlier operas, but a dignity and simplicity worthy of its subject. It is a very beautiful work and deserves its fame as a great opera. Rossini lived for 40 years after he produced this beautiful work, but he wrote no more. Finding that the people of Paris for whom he was to compose his next operas were no longer interested in his work, but had become enthusiastic over the operas of another composer, Meyerbeer, he withdrew from his engagements, and Guillaume Tell, which showed such amazing new strength and beauty, remained his last work. Two other composers of Italian opera of this time are still well known, Donizetti and Bellini. Donizetti, 1798 to 1848, was in his day a famous opera composer. He wrote for the best singers of his time, and his works were very popular. The only ones now heard, and which still have gaiety and charm, are his light operas, La Fille du Régiment, Don Pasquale, and some others. He had the power to pour out tuneful melody. Many of these melodies have their greatest popularity in the present day on barrel organs, for Donizetti wrote mostly for what he considered the popular taste of his day, and his music, though always tuneful, was not always very valuable. Though his musical education was slight, his natural powers were great, and the operas that are still given contain much light, charming music, full of melody, which is one of the most natural and enjoyable gifts of music. Bellini, 1801 to 1835, was a Sicilian. He began to compose when very young, and his work was heard by the manager of two important theaters in Italy, the Scala at Milan and the San Carlo at Naples. He commissioned Bellini to write operas, and the tenor songs in them were to be sung by the famous tenor singer Rubini. Italy was full of the florid music of Rossini when Bellini's music, just simple expressive melody, was produced. Its success was extraordinary. It was sung by the greatest singers all over Europe and delighted the audiences who heard it. Bellini's work is unequal, but the lovely melodies in the operas of his that are still performed, Norma, I Puritani, and La Sonnambula, appeal to everybody. No one can hear them without enjoying them. One other opera composer contemporary with Weber and Rossini must be mentioned, Meyerbeer, 1791 to 1864. His real name was Jacob Meyerbeer, but after studying in Italy, he changed his name to Giacomo Meyerbeer. He was a friend of Weber's when they studied together under Abbé Vogler, and he was the successor of Rossini in Paris, where his most successful operas, Robert le Diable, Les Huguenots, Le Prophète, and L'Africaine, were produced. Parts of these still make a dazzling effect, and though his music is regarded as overemphasized and melodramatic, parts are wonderfully effective. Meyerbeer was most exacting about the performance of his works. There was an interval of years between each opera, while he rewrote and altered and was never satisfied. And the same occurred all through the lengthy rehearsals he demanded. Passages were tried and rearranged until at last the public performance took place. His last opera, L'Africaine, was not produced in his lifetime, for his selection of suitable singers took so long, and his alterations and corrections were still delaying the rehearsals when he died. End of section 16 of Music by Ursula Creighton. Read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, March 7, 2024.